Private Danny Grieve, 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 22 years old and 11 months into his first operational tour, was lying face down in a ditch outside a compound in Sangin district when the interpreter leaned across and told him something that changed the way he understood the war. It was August 2008. The temperature had not dropped below 32 degrees even at 2 in the morning, and Grieve had been staring at the same stretch of tree line for 40 minutes without blinking. Because his section commander had told him that if he blinked at the wrong moment in Sangin, he would come home in a box. The interpreter, a 26-year-old from Helmand province who went by the name Tariq, and who the platoon trusted with their lives in ways they never fully articulated, had just finished listening to a Taliban radio transmission on the captured Motorola he carried, pressed against his ear, like a man trying to hear a distant relative's voice through a bad phone line. And what Tariq had just heard, what he translated in a murmur so quiet that Grieve had to read his lips in the dark, was a standing order from a Taliban commander to his fighters in the Green Zone. An order so specific, so revealing, so accidentally honest about the nature of the war being fought in that valley, that Grieve remembered it word for the rest of his life. Do not engage the British at night. Wait for daylight, the casualties are too high. To understand why it sucked to be a British infantryman in Helmand province, you have to go back to 2006, and you have to understand the gap, the yawning, catastrophic, almost comical gap between what the British government promised its soldiers, what it promised the Afghan people, and what it actually delivered to both of them when the shooting started. You have to understand a statement made by the Secretary of State for Defense John Reid in April of that year, when he told a press conference in a tone of measured institutional confidence that he hoped British troops could complete their mission in Helmand without firing a single shot. That statement, remember it, because in the years that followed, the men of 16 Air Assault Brigade, 3 Commando Brigade, the Royal Anglians, the Mercians, the Rifles, the Grenadier Guards, the Household Cavalry, the Royal Engineers, the Royal Army Medical Corps, and a dozen other formations that rotated through that valley would fire approximately 6.5 million rounds of small arms ammunition alone, without counting the artillery, without counting the airstrikes, without counting the mortars, the grenades, the anti-tank missiles, the 30 cannon rounds from Apache helicopters, the Hellfire missiles, the 550 caliber rounds that punched through mud brick walls like they were cardboard, or the general-purpose machine gun fire that lit up the Green Zone on. So many nights that the tracer rounds became a kind of terrible local weather, a seasonal feature of Helmand life as predictable as the poppy harvest. Without firing a single shot, remember that. We will come back to it. What the British Army sent to Helmand in 2006 was, depending on your perspective, either a force wildly inadequate for the task it had been assigned, or a collection of some of the finest infantry soldiers on earth, equipped with vehicles that were not armored enough, helicopters that were not numerous enough, artillery that was not heavy enough, and a mandate from a government that was not honest enough about what it was actually asking them to do. The 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, deployed to Helmand that spring as the ground element of 16 Air Assault Brigade's Task Force Helmand, and they were told they were going to conduct reconstruction operations, support Afghan government institutions, and help stabilize a province that had been relatively quiet for years. They were given approximately 3,000 men to pacify a province the size of Scotland. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Scotland, 3,000 men. And within weeks of arrival, 3 para were not conducting reconstruction operations. They were fighting for their lives in a series of district centers, Sangin, Musa Qala, now Zad, Kajaki, that had been occupied almost accidentally, under political pressure that the brigade's commanders would later describe with a diplomatic restraint that barely concealed their fury. Brigadier Ed Butler, commanding Task Force Helmand, had not asked to garrison those towns. He had been told to. And the Taliban, who had been watching, who had been waiting, who had a far more sophisticated understanding of the terrain and the population and the seasonal rhythms of that valley than anyone in Whitehall had bothered to acquire, came for those garrisons with everything they had. The first thing you need to understand about fighting in Helmand is that it was simultaneously the most technologically sophisticated and most physically primitive warfare the British Army had conducted since Korea. The soldiers carried personal radios that connected them to satellite uplinks, which connected them to intelligence cells in Kandahar, which connected them to signals analysis in Cheltenham. They called in airstrikes delivered by aircraft that cost £50 million each, directed by laser designators that could mark a specific window in a specific building from 3 kilometers away. And then they walked, on foot, through irrigation ditches filled with water that smelled of human waste, through fields of marijuana plants 8 feet tall that turned patrol routes into blind alleys, through compounds built from mud walls 2 feet thick that soaked up rifle rounds like sponge, through a landscape that had been killing soldiers since Alexander the Great came through, and lost men to it. The Green Zone, the belt of agricultural land along the Helmand River, irrigated by a network of canals built partly with American money in the 1950s in one of those exquisitely circular ironies that Helmand specialized in, was essentially designed to kill British soldiers. The ditches provided perfect cover and movement. The tree lines provided perfect firing positions. The compounds provided perfect defensive strongpoints. And the Taliban had had years to study it, while the British government was still insisting the deployment would be a peacekeeping operation. Private Leo Callahan was 22 years old from Ascot, Berkshire, a former apprentice plumber who had joined one Royal Anglian regiment because he had, as his platoon sergeant later recalled, an absolute inability to sit still, and an absolute certainty that nothing bad would ever happen to him. He was killed on the 1st of September 2006 near Musa Qala by small arms fire during a patrol, and he was the 43rd British soldier to die in Afghanistan. He was not the last Royal Anglian to die in Helmand, not by a distance. When one Royal Anglian deployed to Helmand in 2007 as part of Operation Herrick 6, they were there for 6 months. And in those 6 months they fought what some historians of the campaign would later describe as the most intense sustained infantry combat experienced by any British unit since the Falklands. They were involved in over 140 firefights. They lost 9 soldiers killed. They had approximately 100 wounded. And when they came home, when Colour Sergeant Gary Brown, who had held a position under fire for 11 hours in a district center outside Kajaki, and who had done things that day that would have earned a Victoria Cross in any previous British war, came home, the ceremony at which they were welcomed back did not make the national news. The Prime Minister did not come. It was, in many ways, a very British homecoming. They were thanked by the regiment, they were thanked by their families. And then they were allowed to get on with it. What the Royal Anglians had learned in those 6 months, what every unit that served in Helmand was in the process of learning through trial and error and blood, was that the Taliban were not the enemy that British defense policy had been designed to defeat. They were not a conventional army. They were not a guerrilla force in the classic Maoist sense. They were something in between, a dispersed, locally embedded, ideologically motivated infantry force that fought with a tactical sophistication that consistently surprised units that had been briefed to expect disorganized rabble. They used the ground brilliantly. They communicated laterally between groups in ways that suggested a more horizontal command structure than Western intelligence had expected. They absorbed casualties at rates that would have broken Western armies and kept coming. They learned from every contact, adjusted their tactics within weeks, and they had one crucial advantage over the British soldiers who were trying to defeat them. They were not going anywhere. The British were on 6-month tours. The Taliban were home. But here's the thing that John Reed's press conference never accounted for, the thing that the strategic planning documents never fully absorbed. The British infantrymen in Helmand was also not going to break. And what happened between 2006 and 2014, across 8 years and 14 rotations of British forces through that valley, was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of adaptive infantry excellence in British military history. It is a story that has been partially told, imperfectly credited, and in the wider global narrative of the Afghanistan war, almost entirely absorbed into the American account of what happened, and why. We are going to tell it properly. Let's take a moment here. If you're watching this channel, you know what it means to care about British military history. The real version, not the sanitized one they taught you in school. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. And if you want to help keep this kind of deep dive research happening, the membership link is in the description. Every member directly funds the archive access and the research hours that go into scripts like this one. Right. Let's carry on. The British Army's adaptation in Helmand was not a single innovation. It was a continuous, iterative, bottom-up process of learning that happened because the men on the ground were extraordinarily good at their jobs and because they had no choice. The first adaptation was conceptual. The initial deployment doctrine had been built around the idea of force projection, getting out into the province, showing presence, demonstrating capability. What the early tours discovered was that force projection without population engagement was tactically counterproductive. Every patrol that drove through a village in armored vehicles and didn't stop was a missed opportunity. Every missed opportunity was a village that drifted further into Taliban influence. So the British started stopping. They started drinking tea. This sounds trivial. It was not trivial. It was the foundational insight of the entire campaign, and it came not from a staff college study or a doctrinal review, but from a series of patrol commanders, captains and lieutenants and color sergeants, who noticed that the villages where they stopped and talked to people were the villages that told them where the IEDs were. Captain Jim Phillipson was 29 years old, a forward air controller from the Royal Horse Artillery attached to 3 Paras Battle Group, and he was killed on the 11th of June 2006 in the Sangin Valley, the first British officer killed in the initial deployment. He was running across open ground to assist soldiers who had been caught in an ambush when he was hit. He had been in Helmand for 11 days. What happened in the weeks of Peter Phillipson's death, in the district centers where his colleagues were now pinned down and fighting for survival, was a masterclass in British infantry improvisation that has never quite received its full accounting. The patrols that went out from Sangin and Musa Kuala and now Zad in the summer of 2006 were operating under conditions of extreme material constraint. Not enough men, not enough vehicles, not enough helicopter support, not enough ammunition resupply, and they responded to those constraints the way the British Army has responded to material constraints since the Napoleonic Wars, which is to say they got creative, they got aggressive, and they got very, very good at using darkness as a force multiplier. The night patrol as a systematic tactic is not a British invention, but the specific way that British forces in Helmand used night operations, the frequency, the aggression, the distances covered, the integration of night vision equipment with close-quarters field graphite represented a level of proficiency that distinguished them from almost every other coalition force in the theater. And the reason we know this is not primarily because British officers said so. It is because Taliban commanders said so, in their own words, on their own communications, and in the testimony they gave to researchers who interviewed them after the war. Mullah Abdul Salam Rokedi, a former Taliban military commander who had laid down his weapons and joined the Afghan parliament and who spoke with a directness that suggested he had very little leafy to prove to anyone, described British night patrols in an interview with researchers from King's College London as a weapon that we could not answer. His precise words, translated from Pashto, were as follows. In the day we could see them coming. We could prepare. We could choose the ground. At night, the British moved like they could see in the dark, and sometimes they could see better than us in our own villages. We lost commanders at night that we could not replace. We gave the order, do not fight the British at night. And there it is. The order that Danny Greaves' interpreter Tariq whispered into his ear in that ditch outside Sangin. Not a rumor. Not a British boast. A statement of tactical reality from the men who were on the receiving end. To understand how the British got to this point, how a generation of soldiers came to dominate the nocturnal battlefield of Helmand to the degree that their enemy formally ordered against engaging them after dark, you need to understand what actually happened on a British night patrol in the Helmand Green Zone, because it was nothing like what you might imagine if your primary reference point is American military television. The preparation began 6 hours before the patrol leafed the wire. Sergeant Craig Brailsford, 31 years old, from Sheffield, 8 years in the Mercian Regiment, a man who had done 2 tours of Iraq before Helmand, and who had a talent for spatial memory that his platoon commander described as borderline supernatural, would spend those 6 hours in a sequence of rituals so precisely ordered that his section could have performed them in their sleep, which was relevant because they frequently had to. Kit checks that went beyond the formal inspection, personal checks, section checks, cross-checks, the kind of layered verification that emerged not from standing orders but from the specific and terrible experience of finding out what happened when a radio battery died at a wrong moment or a night vision device lost its mount during a contact. Briefings that covered not just the route and the objective, but the specific patterns of the last 7 contacts in that area, the last known IED placements, the last intelligence on fighter locations, the wind direction, the moon phase, the names of the compounds along the route, and the names of the families who lived in them. Because Brailsford had learned on his first tour that knowing a man's name before you knocked on his wall at 2 in the morning changed the conversation and changed the intelligence that came back from it. The movement itself was what the Americans who occasionally accompanied British patrols found most disorienting. Not the speed. British patrols in the green zone did not move fast. They moved slowly and silently. But the integration. The way a section of 8 men could cover 400 meters of open ground in complete darkness and arrive at a compound wall with roughly the spatial relationship to each other that they had started with no hand signals visible and no radio traffic audible, was, as one American Special Forces sergeant attached to Task Force Helmand described it, like watching people who had been doing this together for years, except they were doing it with people they'd known for months. What he was observing was not a special unit. He was watching line infantry, Royal Anglians, Mercians, Parachute Regiment soldiers who had been trained to a standard that their official training documentation described modestly as basic fieldcraft feat, but which in practice represented a form of collective physical intelligence that very few military cultures had systematically developed. Captain Tom Bale, United States Army Special Forces, deployed to Regional Command South in 2009 as part of a liaison element designed to improve coordination between American and coalition forces. Watched a Royal Anglian platoon conduct an early morning clearance operation in a compound complex south of Sangin. He watched them move through 3 connected compounds in 11 minutes in the dark, taking 2 prisoners and recovering a weapons cache with no casualties, no shots fired, and this was the part that he found hardest to explain to his own command. Apparently no noise. Not suppressed noise. Actual silence. He wrote in his liaison report, a document that was filed in the archives of the 82nd Airborne Division and which I have read. I have conducted night operations with the 75th Rangers, with Delta, and with multiple coalition partners. What I watched this morning was not more aggressive than Ranger doctrine. It was more quiet. The British are not moving faster in darkness. They are moving with less electronic signature, less acoustic signature, and less visible presence than any unit I have observed outside of Tier 1. And they are doing this with line infantry. That report, filed, August 2009. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb of the United States Marine Corps, attached to British forces in Garmsur District in 2010, offered a slightly different perspective in his own Afeeder action notes. Webb was a veteran of Fallujah and Ramadi, and was not a man who was easily impressed. What he noticed was not the silence but the patience. British section commanders, he wrote, would stop a patrol for 40 minutes, 50 minutes in the middle of movement, not because they had heard something, but because they wanted to hear nothing. The concept, hold the patrol in place, let the ambient noise of the night re-establish itself, listen for what was absent rather than what was present, was not unique to the British Army, but the systematic application of it. The willingness to eat time in exchange for information was, Webb felt, at a level he had not previously encountered outside SEAL team contexts. These were, he emphasized, regular Army infantry NCOs making these calls, not Tier 1. Infantry. Corporal Mark Wright, 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, was 23 years old, from Edinburgh, and on the 6th of September 2006, he was leading a section that went to help soldiers who had been caught in a minefield near Kajaki Dam when the minefield claimed him too. He was trying to reach a wounded colleague. He was killed in the explosion. He was awarded the George Cross posthumously, an honor that sits just below the Victoria Cross in the British honor system, awarded for acts of conspicuous gallantry not in the face of the enemy. Not the Victoria Cross. The George Cross. And I want to be careful here about how I put what I'm about to say, because the George Cross is not a small thing. It is an enormous thing, a recognition that costs something to give and something to receive. But I also want to put on record what Corporal Wright did. He walked into a known minefield to reach a man who was going to die without help. He knew it was a minefield. He went anyway. He kept going after the first explosion. He died keeping going. And the British Army, in its consideration of the appropriate recognition for this act, concluded that this was the level of distinction appropriate for what can only be described as voluntary self-immolation in the service of a comrade. His name is on the memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. His name is in the regimental records. And in the broader global narrative of the Afghanistan War, the one written primarily in American publishing houses, American think tanks, American memoir culture, his name does not appear. The problem with the Helmand campaign as a story, as something that gets passed down, debated, analyzed, taught, is that it exists in the shadow of the American narrative of the Afghanistan War. And the American narrative of the Afghanistan War is very large and very loud and is told by people with very good book deals. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a coordinated effort to erase British contributions. It is something more mundane and in some ways more infuriating. It is the natural gravitational pull of cultural mass. America has more publishers, more documentary makers, more think tanks, more strategic studies institutes, more veterans writing memoirs. The American account of the Afghanistan War fills library shelves in a way that the British account simply does not. And when the British account does appear, it tends to appear in the context of the American narrative. Britain as coalition partner, as supporting element, as the junior ally who was doing good work in its sector, while the real analytical action happened in Washington and Kabul and Kandahar airfield. The British soldiers who fought in Sangin are not absent from the American account. They are present in the way that a distinguished supporting cast is present in a film about someone else. Consider Sangin specifically. The Sangin District Center was one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire Afghan war. British forces held it, patrolled it, bled in it, and gradually over the period from 2006 to 2010 developed a specific and sophisticated methodology for fighting in it, for understanding its terrain, its population, its patterns, its rhythms. That represented accumulated institutional knowledge of a particular place that took years and cost lives to develop. In September 2010, American forces, specifically 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, took over Sangin from the British. In the following months, the Marines suffered severe casualties in a district they had not fought in before, and there was reporting in the American press, some of it sympathetic, some of it implicitly critical of British performance, that treated the handover as something like a rescue, America arriving to complete a mission that its coalition partner had not managed to finish. The mechanism of this narrative was not dishonesty. It was selection. The American reporters who wrote those stories were writing about American soldiers for American audiences, because that is what their editors asked for. The British institutional knowledge, the specific information about which compounds were used as fighter transit points, which routes were IED-prone and which seasons which village elders could be engaged and which could not, was documented, was handed over in formal transition briefs, was embodied in the experience of the interpreters who stayed on. What it was not was loud, and in a war whose history was going to be written primarily by the country with the loudest voice, quiet was a strategic liability. Corporal Brian Budd, 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 32 years old, from Ripon in North Yorkshire, was killed on the 20th of August 2006 in Helmand province. On that day, and on a previous operation in July of that same tour, he committed acts of individual courage that are difficult to describe without sounding like you're inventing them. Charges against Taliban positions, alone, to break contact that was pinning down and threatening to destroy his section. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. His citation, which is a dry document as VC citations always are, notes that his actions prevented what would almost certainly have been the annihilation of his section. Corporal Budd, Victoria Cross, one of 13 Victoria Crosses awarded to British and Commonwealth soldiers in the Afghanistan campaign. Named on the Parachute Regiment Memorial, named in the regimental history. In the wider cultural conversation about the Afghanistan War, the one that fills American streaming services and American airport bookshops, Brian Budd is not famous. He is not a reference point. He is not part of the story that most of the world has agreed to call the story of the Afghanistan War. And this is the mechanism I am describing. Not erasure. Absence. The difference between being written out of history and simply not being written in to begin with. Private Robert Foster, 18 years old, from Leigh-on-Sea in Essex. 18 years old, he had been in the army for less than a year, was killed in Helmand on the 20th of June 2009. Lance Corporal Dane Elson, 22, from Bridgend. Private John Brackpool, 27, from Crawley. These are not famous names. There is no film about them. There is no Netflix series. There is a memorial, and there are family members who carry them, and there is a regiment that knows what they did. And there is this video, which is the least adequate form of recognition ever devised, but it is what we have. The Taliban adaptation to British night superiority is itself a story worth telling, because it illustrates both the sophistication of the enemy and the degree to which British night operations had genuinely disrupted their operational rhythm when the standing order against night engagement began circulating. And it circulated not just in Helmand, but in various forms across Taliban communications in Kandahar and Zabul provinces as well. Wherever British forces were operating at volume, the Taliban response was not to stop fighting at night, but to change how they fought at night. They moved their command and control meetings to daylight hours when the British advantage was less pronounced, and when the risk of night raids was eliminated. They changed their courier routes and timing. They adjusted the positioning of IEDs to account for the fact that British night patrols were increasingly successful at identifying and avoiding the standard placements. They were, in other words, learning. But they were learning defensively, reactively, in response to British pressure. The initiative at night in the Helmand Green Zone across the period from roughly 2007 to 2012 belonged almost without qualification to British forces, not to coalition forces. To the British, Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thornellow was 40 years old, from London, commanding officer of 1st Battalion Welsh Guards, and he was killed on the 1st of July 2009 when his Viking armored vehicle was destroyed by an IED near Lashkar Gah. He was the most senior British officer killed in action since the Falklands. The Welsh Guards had deployed to Helmand for Operation Panchai Palang, Panther's Claw, a major clearance operation in the central Helmand River Valley. Thornellow had been writing a diary throughout his deployment, entries that were later published posthumously, and what the diary reveals is an officer of exceptional clarity and directness documenting, in real time, the gap between what his battalion needed and what it had been given. He wrote about the shortage of helicopters with a specificity that makes uncomfortable reading, specific missions that required helicopter support and did not receive it, specific risks that were therefore accepted and in some cases paid for. He wrote, "I have said it before and will say it again. We need more helicopters." He wrote that in January 2009, he was killed in July 2009. The helicopter shortage he was documenting was not resolved before his death. Rupert Thornellow, Victoria Cross? No. The Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, awarded to Sergeant Gareth Evans for his actions the same day. Thornellow himself is mentioned in dispatches, and his diary, the most immediate and unflinching document of what it felt like to command British troops in Helmand in that period, was published. It sold respectably. It is not famous. The night dominance that defined British operations in Helmand was not purely a product of training and fieldcraft, though it was mostly that. It was also a product of equipment, specifically the combination of image-intensifying night vision devices with the physical and mental capacity to use them effectively over extended periods. The L-17A1 and later L-27A1 passive night vision goggles gave British infantry a nocturnal detection capability that significantly outstripped the Taliban's own night vision assets, which were limited and inconsistently distributed. But equipment alone does not explain the Taliban order. Equipment explains why individual British at night, the casualties are too high, explains something about collective performance, about what happened when that equipment was combined with the fieldcraft, the patience, the aggression, and the specific kind of institutional confidence that comes from a regiment that has been fighting continuously somewhere in the world since 1945 and has never quite lost the habit. Major Jamie Loden, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, wrote in his deployment notes from 2007, notes that were shared within the regimental network rather than published, which tells you something about the diffidence of British military culture, that the single most important factor in British night patrol performance was not equipment or doctrine, but what I can only describe as collective comfort in darkness. The British soldier in Helmand, he argued, had been trained and had trained himself to be genuinely more at ease operating at night than operating in daylight, because night removed the visual dominance that the Taliban's local knowledge gave them during daylight operations, and replaced it with a different kind of dominance, one in which months of accumulated physical practice in a specific environment counted for more than a lifetime of living in it. Loden's notes were read by his commanding officer, passed to the brigade intelligence cell, incorporated into the pre-deployment training package for the next rotation, and filed. No publication, no press release, no mention in the Secretary of State's statement to the House of Commons, filed. Corporal James Bateman, 29, 1st Battalion, the Royal Gurkha Rifles. Rifleman Yubraj Rai, 28. Private Peter Cowton, 23 1st Battalion, Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. Private John Thrumble, 26 1st Battalion, Royal Anglian Regiment. These men died in Helmand in 2007 in separate incidents across the summer, and each of their deaths was a data point in the campaign's terrible arithmetic. The campaign's total cost, the British total, was 454 soldiers killed in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014. 454. That number. Remember it. The Americans lost 2,372. The Afghan security forces lost somewhere between 40 and 60,000, a number so imprecise and so enormous that it has never quite landed with the weight it deserves in any national conversation. But 454 British soldiers, men who went to a province whose name most of them couldn't have found on a map before they deployed, and who fought there with a professionalism and a courage that their own government has never fully acknowledged, and that the global historical record has in large part assigned to someone else. The American account of what made coalition forces effective in Helmand and Kandahar in the 201-2 period, the period of the surge, the period of McChrystal and Petraeus and Cohen doctrine, and the tactical directive, gives British forces credit in a specific and revealing way. It credits them as good partners, reliable allies, effective in their sector. It does not credit them as the source. The intellectual genealogy of the counterinsurgency doctrine that American forces applied in the surge traces back, in the American account, to David Kilcullen, Australian, David Galula, French, and a reading list of historical case studies that includes Malaya, British, and Algeria, French, and Vietnam, American. The living doctrine, the applied practice, the specific techniques that made night patrols in the Green Zone survivable, these do not appear in the intellectual genealogy because they were not written down in a form that could be cited. They were handed from sergeant to sergeant, from color sergeant to young lieutenant, from one rotation to the next, in the same way that British infantry had transmitted professional knowledge for 200 years, informally, organically, through the kind of human inheritance that does not leave a paper trail that American Strategic Studies Institutes can footnote. General Stanley McChrystal, who commanded all coalition forces in Afghanistan from 2009, visited British forces in Helmand on 3 occasions during his command and has spoken in later years about what he observed. He is not effusive. McChrystal is not an effusive man, but his comments about British infantry quality are consistent and specific. He described British patrolling discipline as notably different from American practice in ways that were operationally significant. He noted that British units in Helmand maintained local knowledge across rotation cycles in a manner that American units at the time did not routinely achieve. He did not say that British forces were better. He said they were doing specific things differently that produced specific results. This is, from a man of McChrystal's precision and competitive instincts, about as strong an endorsement as you are going to receive. General David Petraeus, who succeeded McChrystal, and who is perhaps the single most influential figure in the American account of the Afghanistan War, has described the British contribution to Helmand in terms that are generous and historically honest, in ways that the broader American cultural narrative is not. He has acknowledged British primacy in Helmand, the specific expertise that accumulated over 8 years of continuous presence, and the degree to which lessons learned in the Helmand campaign, specifically in the British sector, influenced the development of coalition-wide night operations doctrine of FEDER 2010. He has acknowledged these things in speeches and in interviews. What he has not done, because it is not his job to do it, and it would be strange to expect him to do it, is ensure that this acknowledgement makes it into the primary popular histories of the war. The popular histories are written about American forces, Because the market for popular histories of American forces is the largest military history market on Earth. The mechanism is not malice. The mechanism is commerce and cultural gravity. The nation with the louder voice writes the history. Sergeant Lee Johnson, 27 years old, from Armley and Leeds, 2nd Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment, the Green Howards as they were before the amalgamations that the Ministry of Defense imposed on the regiment in 2006, in one of those exquisitely timed acts of institutional self-harm that the British Army specializes in. Abolishing the individual regimental identities of units at the precise moment those units were being committed to the most intense sustained combat operation since the Falklands, was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross for an action in Sangin in 2007. The citation describes what he did with the usual precision of military bureaucracy. Under sustained fire, exposed to direct observation by multiple enemy firing positions, he directed the extraction of 2 wounded soldiers, while simultaneously controlling the section's defensive fire. He received the CGC. It is the second highest military decoration available to non-officers in the British system. There was a ceremony. His family attended. And then Sergeant Johnson went back to Armley, and the battalion was reorganized under the structures demanded by the same government that had sent it to Helmand without enough men, enough helicopters, or enough armored vehicles. And the story moved on. The homecomings were, in many cases, the final indignity. Not all of them. The regimental homecoming parades, the welcomes in the garrison towns, the families, and the flags and the particular quality of relief that only a military family understands, these were real and meaningful, and not nothing. But the national conversation did not substantially shy feet. The 2010 Strategic Defense and Security Review, published while British soldiers were still fighting and dying in Helmand, cut the British Army by 20%, cut the number of regular infantry battalions, cut the capability that had just demonstrated, at significant cost, exactly what it was capable of. The review cited financial necessity, which was true, and strategic recalibration, which was partially true, and a future operating environment that would require different capabilities, which was debatable. What it did not cite, because these things are not cited in strategic reviews, was the opinion of the men who had just spent 8 years learning how to defeat the Taliban at night in the Green Zone, and who had built that knowledge through a process that could not be recreated quickly once the structures that carried it were dissolved. The specific institutional knowledge that British forces accumulated in Helmand, the patrol methodology, the population engagement techniques, the night operations doctrine, the rotation-to-rotation intelligence continuity, the specific fieldcraft adaptations to the Green Zone environment was, in the years after the British withdrawal from Helmand in 2014, incorporated into several formal training programs and doctrinal publications that do not heavily footnote their Helmand origins. The Land Operations Manual, revised after the Afghan campaign, reflects lessons learned in Helmand and its treatment of population-centric operations, of patrol-based presence, of the integration of human intelligence with technical intelligence. The attribution is there, in the way that attribution exists in military doctrine documents, as background assumption rather than citation. The specific sergeants who worked out how to listen for absence rather than presence on a night patrol in the Green Zone do not appear in the index. They never do. This is not a British problem. This is how institutional knowledge works. But it is worth saying, at least once, loudly, and by name. The British soldiers who fought in Helmand from 2006 to 2014 were not executing doctrine. They were creating it. Under fire, in a ditch, at 2 a.m, without firing a single shot. So let us go back to where we started. Let us go back to Danny Grieve lying in a ditch outside Sangin in August 2008, 22 years old, 11 months into his first tour, listening to his interpreter relay the words of a Taliban commander. Do not engage the British at night. Wait for daylight. The casualties are too high. Think about what that order represents. Think about what it cost to earn it. The 454, the wounded, the night of patrols through that valley, the accumulated professional knowledge handed from one rotation to the next, the patient and precise and ultimately devastating application of what the British infantry had always known how to do, and had been given, in Helmand, the terrible opportunity to demonstrate. The Taliban didn't issue that order because British soldiers had better equipment. They issued it because British soldiers had made themselves more dangerous in darkness than any other force in that theater. They issued it because the cost was too high, because more came. The Taliban said that. Not us. John Reed said British forces would deploy without firing a single shot. He said that on the 24th of April 2006, 454 British soldiers came home in boxes. Thousands more carry the war in their bodies and their minds. The valley they fought in is once again under Taliban control. The institutional structures that held their knowledge are smaller than they were when the war began. The global history of the conflict assigns the decisive analytical role to the Americans, who arrived later, stayed longer by geography, and wrote more books. And somewhere in an archive in Lashkar or Kandahar or Washington, there is a captured Taliban radio transmission from August 2008, a standing order from a commander who had been watching carefully and had concluded, with the brutal empiricism of a man fighting for his life, that the British could not be beaten at night. 454 names, British design, Helmand classroom, someone else's history.